While video games have been an art form that I've been deeply invested in since childhood, film has been there longer. Even though this channel's focus is on video games, I do try to keep up as best I can with movies and talk about them when I can, or when I find something worth talking about, like with the movie Men. But despite the significantly less time investment it takes to experience a movie compared to experiencing a video game, especially recently,
they're 100 hours long.
If I want to relax and unwind, I'm gonna play a video game and potentially shut my brain off. And recently, that's kind of what I need.
Debt, taxes, shops, income, rent.
And what that means is that my movie watching has taken a rather large hit. Sure, I have periods where I'll watch a bunch of movies in a pretty condensed span of time, but those are getting fewer and far between. And just like my Steam library, my Letterboxd watch list only seems to grow and grow, and the movies I watch rarely ends up being ones from that list. But in an effort to counter this dwindling viewing of film, I decided to finally take on an idea for a video that I've had for roughly 2 years now, which is watching 24 A24 movies. A24, if you're not aware, is a movie distribution and production company that was started in 2012 and remained largely unknown to the general public until it started making mainstream attention with movies like Hereditary, Lady Bird, Ex Machina, and Moonlight. At the time of this video's publishing, its highest grossing film is Everything Everywhere All at Once. A24 is a studio that I've been aware of for a little while. I think the first movie that I ever saw from them was A Ghost Story, based on the recommendation from Red Letter Media way back in the day. But I guess I didn't realize how many movies from A24 I had seen since. So going into this video, I had a couple of rules that I wanted to follow to keep it interesting.
Rule number 1.
It can't be a movie that I've seen before.
Rule number 2.
The movies have to range from the entirety of A24's time as a company.
Rule number 3.
Even if I have seen a trailer for the movie before, I can't look up anything other than a basic premise of the film, going in as blind as humanly possible.
Rule number 4.
I won't spoil the movies for you. And for the sake of presentation, I'm not going to show them in the order that I watched them. I'm going to do them from the 24th worst to the number 1 best movie that I watched.
You gonna have pie for dinner?
We're gonna have macaroni for dinner. We got leftover macaroni. We're gonna put that on top of the pie.
So I knew I eventually would hit a bad movie. This was like the 3rd or 4th movie on this list. But oh man, I was not prepared for 1, how soon that would happen, and 2, how truly awful the movie would be. It's slow, meandering. It's a drama thriller movie about a family whose daughter has been taken away from them one morning, and the story is told through interweaving storylines that take place at random points during the time frame of their daughter's disappearance. I will give the movie credit in that it does shoot for the stars, but doesn't even manage to lift itself off the ground. Ryan Reynolds is doing his best with what's given to him, but the entire movie, from basically the beginning all the way until the very end, feels like it came straight out of an A&E tax write-off. The villain of the movie is the most bog-standard British wannabe who literally shows his captive Mozart as an attempt to come across as an elegant and smart evil individual, but only comes across as legit cringe. Rosaria fucking Dawson is in this, and she looks like she couldn't give any less of a fuck. It was a shocking mix of mediocre writing, incredibly cheap and flat visual style, painfully acted, and I seriously cannot emphasize enough how much this feels like a cheap TV drama. Only in the most occasional brief glimpses of not even mediocrity does the movie pull itself out of its seemingly endless lull and present you with like a nice shot or an actually impactful emotional moment. But it's so few and far between that the entire movie feels like a chore to sit through. I'm not sugarcoating this, But at 112 minutes, I sped up the last 20 minutes or so, and I didn't feel bad about it. A random review I found on Letterboxd sums it up better than I ever could. The title is apt because I felt like a captive being punished for something while watching this.
It's a gateway drug. It is a gateway drug. You smoke weed, and then guess what? Meth equals death.
Barely Lethal is barely watchable. Thank you. But in all seriousness, this was the second movie that I watched in a row that clearly shows that A24, despite the prestige that the name brings now, had to find its footing some way, somehow. Barely Lethal is a comedy that tells the story of Agent 83, an orphan who has spent basically her entire life up until the start of the movie in a secret agent training camp for girls. During a high-stakes mission, Agent 83 fakes her own death and attempts to integrate herself into normal teenager life, but wacky shenanigans will ensue. The movie starts with a fun title credit sequence that explains the character well enough, but then immediately after the credit sequence gives you exposition explaining exactly what you just saw, which was the first oh no sign. This is, and I'm not kidding, a Disney Channel movie. I am kidding, but it's not. It's not a joke. And I think it's making fun of these kinds of movies. I'm honestly not really sure. There should never be at any point during a comedy where you're asking, was that a joke? There are points where it plays out like one of these lame, kid-centered Disney Channel TV comedies that you're almost expecting an actual laugh track or a cut to commercial at any given second, but then there are moments where it will randomly have an unironically amazing sequence, whether it's a consistently funny scene like the interrogation scene roughly halfway through the film.
Aziz, Fatah, Zabaro, when the hell were you in Lebanon?
Sabaro Pizzeria. It's the world's largest mall-based Italian restaurant chain. They make these amazing garlic nuts.
Amazing garlic nuts.
Or actually having a cool set piece like the opening action scene. It's such a bizarre circumstance that its inability to decide what it wants to be hinders any potential enjoyment that the movie could get out of me. Throughout 80% of its runtime, I was sitting there asking myself, what is this movie? It's not even that long either. But when it decides to lean into its comedy side, it just drags on and on. The hope that the movie will be a zany A24 comedy dwindles further and further down. It is cliche after cliche, and there was a point where I forgot that this girl was a secret agent. When the plot point actually comes back, it's so that she can rearrange her classroom so she can sit by a douchey musician that the school is in love with. That all being said, I would absolutely watch this again with friends because I think that one, it's a near perfect movie to laugh at rather than laugh with, and two, like I said previously, there are glimmers of a legitimately good comedy in here. Some of the editing with dialogue is quick and frantic, leading to some sudden jokes that did get a laugh out of me, and when the movie finally decides to lean into its genre parody side, it is actually a decent flick for bits and pieces. But as it stands, I can't in any good faith put this higher than The Captive.
You know what? You know what? Find your own goddamn ride.
The Monster is one of the most whatever movies I think I've ever seen. It's a horror movie that definitely gives off the vibe that it thinks that it's a lot deeper than it is. And even if it is more deep than I am giving it credit for, it definitely isn't as smart as it thinks it is. The Monster is about a mom and a daughter who, and I can't emphasize this enough, hate each other.
Don't talk to me like that.
Fuck you, fuck you.
Talk to me like that.
Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you.
The movie attempts to find a heart between these two, and throughout the movie, it attempts to mend that relationship. And the movie doesn't necessarily do a bad job at mending that relationship, but everything about this movie is just the most bog standard, shallow attempt to make a monster as metaphor horror movie, which is one of my favorite tropes in horror. That style of horror movie adds so much depth to what could be something so shallow, and whereas movies like Friday the 13th stand outside of the pool, afraid to jump in, the monster seems to be completely satisfied with just staying on that first step into the shallow end. Whenever anything of value was being displayed between the mom and the daughter, I couldn't help but just think about this one scene. The whole point of the movie is that these two are rekindling their relationship on a night where their car was damaged during a rainstorm on a trip to drop the daughter off at her father's place. The most that this movie ever got out of me was a weak, pathetic, "Oh, okay." That all being said, it would be disingenuous to say that there aren't things to enjoy about the movie. Some of the cinematography is pretty good. The little girl's acting is surprisingly pretty solid. And even though I was just talking mad trash on how it tackled its monster as metaphor, the fact that there is something there at all, I think, is of some value. It's definitely not the worst movie I've seen, not by a long shot, but it's not much better.
Double, toil and trouble, fire burn, and cauldron bubble.
And this is where everyone watching the video realizes that I'm as dumb as a sack of wet rocks. I think I might just hate Shakespeare, and it's not even like his fault. The premise of most of his stories are great, and this movie specifically has a lot of really cool stuff going on, with so many legendary sequences and storytelling bits so influential that they're still being borrowed today. Okay, hear me out, please. I hate Shakespearean dialogue, okay? I'm sorry. The way my brain works, I can't just listen to what's being said in these plays and adaptations. I can't help myself from trying to decipher these poetic lines, trying to read between the lines, or find meaning underneath the stanzas, and by the time that I even comprehend what a line could mean, I'm already like 3 or 4 lines behind of what's actually being said, so I'm constantly playing catch up and getting lost and frustrated rather quickly. So that was issue number 1 that I have with this movie, which I understand is not the movie's fault, it's mine. My second issue, though, is that I also just don't like Shakespearean acting. It comes across as hammy and like really lame. That might just be me being a grumpy Gus, but even in this movie, despite being mostly grounded, especially for a Shakespearean adaptation, the acting was not only kind of distracting, but grating for me on occasion. Denzel Washington plays Macbeth, and while he mostly plays the part pretty straight, everyone around him is pretty over the top and was just not enjoyable to sit through. The one exception to this were the witches, who were so perfectly cast as creepy otherworldly entities that every time they were on screen, they made the movie light up, and I was totally engrossed with what was happening. The famous double bubble toil and trouble scene from this movie was easily my favorite scene in the entire movie. But was there anything I liked? Well, yeah, it's not at the bottom. Visually, this might be the best movie on the entire list. The set design and atmosphere of this movie is so off the rails my thing that it was actually upsetting that I hated everything else so much, because I wanted to live in this movie for a while. I might watch this movie again at some point on mute and just enjoy the visuals play out in front of me, because every single shot in this movie is masterfully framed, the lighting is otherworldly, and the atmosphere is drenched in gloom and fog. It's a sight to behold. The set design is single-handedly why this movie isn't the second movie mentioned. Also, Denzel goes hard as Macbeth. It's worth looking at 100 times over. I want frames of this movie on my wall. I want to be inside this film. I just never want to listen to it again.
Come on!
Out now.
It's gonna melt outside.
It's melting inside, too.
But Bobby,
Huh?
Thank you very much.
you're not welcome.
The Florida Project is an interesting counterpart to a movie that will appear later on this list, Lady Bird. Both are slices of life on either side of the United States, and both of them showcase the beauty that lies in the mundane or broken lives that the characters live. Whereas Lady Bird feels like a slice of life turned into a movie, the Florida Project feels like you're a fly on the wall of this family and this motel nearby Disney World. You see the world through the eyes of these kids, and you also see the world as it is around them with the decisions made by the adults in their lives. You stand alongside arguments, self-destructive behavior, and while all of that is incredibly well shot and genuinely well acted by everyone involved, especially the main little girl who is on screen for pretty much the entire runtime of the movie, I just couldn't fully get into this one. I appreciated the story being told, but it took a while for me to find its through line. I appreciated the real look at this mother who clearly loves her daughter more than anything, but I couldn't fully find myself committing to the main mom character. I get what the movie is doing, but it felt weird that the movie was trying to balance showing how much of an actual good mom she is, doing whatever she can to keep them afloat somehow, but the mom is at the same time so self-destructive, and specifically in a way that only seems to bring danger to or around her daughter. And I don't want to sound insensitive because I know that this is a life that many struggling parents might find themselves in, but at least to me in regards to a movie, it felt like the way that this character was presented was trying to have its cake and eat it too. The thing that stood out to me the most in regards to this is Willem Dafoe's character, who owns the motel that the mom and the daughter are staying at. He is doing everything in his power throughout the entire movie to do what he can for this mom and this girl. And the mom is just so disrespectful to Willem Dafoe at all times, actively hindering the goodwill that is being given to them from Willem Dafoe's character. Like, it seemed throughout the entire movie, despite how much she loves her daughter, she's actively putting her in potential danger. It felt weird to have such drastically polar opposite character traits that never seems to even attempt to meet in the middle as the movie went on. The saddest thing though is that that's the biggest issue that I had with the movie. There were other things about the movie that kind of irked me, like the runtime. You could probably shave off 10 minutes, and that ending has only gotten worse as time has gone on. If the mom's character even worked just a little bit better for me, I think that this movie would be quite a few pegs higher on the list. But as it stands, it is a pretty great example of a genuinely beautiful slice of life and presented in a way that is actually very unique and very much this film's own. I respect it for that. I just wish I could be more on board for more than the vibes and the gorgeous cinematography.
Woody, we're gonna go get me cube. We've gotta go to Bendigo to get me green cube. We're gonna go to Bendigo, Morty. Oh, Rick, Bendigo?
This one hurts to put as low as it is. I love horror movies, and Hereditary, also being an A24 movie, is one of my all-time favorite movies. But I remember seeing trailers for this, and thinking that at the time that it felt like an oddly generic horror movie to be pushed out by A24. I'm all for them trying something more mainstream, but something about this one just felt weird. But when Talk to Me released, I heard so much praise about it and how it was a genuinely scary movie with new directorial voices, 2 YouTubers of all people. So even though it took me until now to see it, I was pretty excited to see A24 pull off a more mainstream horror film while hopefully still maintaining their seemingly copyrighted brand of elevated horror. They kinda did, sorta. Talk to Me is the story of Mia, who becomes enticed in this friend group, who seem to have found a magic hand that could potentially communicate with the dead. She and her best friend, and her best friend's brother, go to a party and soon become obsessed with this hand, and things progressively build into chaos. I won't lie when I say that a lot of the aesthetics surrounding this movie still fits in line what A24 seems to have been branded with, but even with that, there is something so off about this movie, and I'm not sure if it was me expecting more of like a cerebral, elevated kind of horror, or if the premise of possession is just a turnoff for me no matter what when it comes to horror. But Talk to Me, despite a genuinely fantastic and honestly very unique premise with its own new lore and mythology, comes across as very muddled, and I'm not sure what it was trying to say. There are some great ideas even outside of the premise, and I honestly appreciated how bleak this movie ended up being. It feels like something Junji Ito would make. It feels akin to a lot more of like the unknowledgeable, unknowable horror of Lovecraft, or like a lot of Japanese horror. Talk to Me doesn't hold very many punches in terms of its story and where it decides to go, but there was just this very strange feeling of, well, they clearly were trying to say something about the main character and their arc, but when you see those parallels pay off by the end, things just don't really add up to me. I love horror as metaphor, It's what makes the movie Men one of my all-time favorite films, let alone horror movies, but Talk to Me, upon a full and engaged watch, left me feeling like I wanted to talk to the directors and ask, what was the point?
Ivan, it's all going to hell.
What?
The rebars in the shuttering in pit 6, they wouldn't hold hit and fire. Those mavericks up from up north.
Right off the bat, I think Locke is a pretty damn polarizing movie. I knew nothing about most of these movies going into them, and I basically chose this one off the poster alone and the glowing reviews that I briefly saw on it. The only thing that I knew about the movie going into it was that Tom Hardy was in it, and that he must drive a car at some point. And almost immediately, the movie starts with Tom Hardy getting into his car and driving off into the freeway. He makes a few calls to his son, a co-worker, and a mysterious woman, but as the calls continue, you quickly realize that this woman is someone that he got pregnant, and that she's clearly not his wife. So within the first 5 minutes, the stakes were set, and I was hooked. I loved how intimate and personal the movie was, how real it seemed, and how human it felt. Tom Hardy's character, Ivan Locke, goes through the entire spectrum of emotions. He straight up kills this movie with an unbelievably heartfelt performance. The entire movie takes place in Locke's car as he drives to the hospital where this mysterious woman is giving birth. It reminded me a lot of the movie Buried, starring Ryan Reynolds from way back, which is also a pretty damn good movie. I heard a lot of people shit on that one. There's phone call after phone call, and for the most part, the movie maintains this level of exasperation that I found really impressive. The movie isn't tense, so to say, but more just exudes this feeling of desperation. Ivan forgets stuff that he left back at his job hours ago. He has arguments with his boss. He struggles to hold a conversation with his wife. Everything is just falling apart around this guy as he makes his way to this hospital to be there for this random woman that he slept with. There are themes of generational trauma, grief, self-destruction, and this feeling that even though Ivan did really fuck up, he isn't a bad guy at all. I'm glad I gave this one a go, because like the worst thing I could say about it is that the movie is a bit too long for its own good, and the last 30 minutes sort of dragged on a bit despite the story reaching its climax. If you were able to shave off 20 minutes, bare minimum 15, I think that it would be much higher on this list. If you saw Buried and enjoyed it, and I know it definitely wasn't for everyone, then I do think you should watch this one too, because it's a type of movie that isn't done very often, and I've enjoyed 100% of the ones like it that I've seen. Keeping myself blind on basically every one of these movies has, honestly, in retrospect, been a pretty great experience. It keeps my expectations wildly in the wind. It's not often that I go into a movie completely blind, and Slow West was another example of being surprised by basically every single thing in the film. Slow West tells the story of a young man named Jay from Scotland and his journey across the Wild West to find the woman that he loves and his adventures doing so. Along the way, he comes across Silas, excellently portrayed by Michael Fassbender in one of his better performances that I've seen, as a gunman who decides to help Jay find this woman. Silas's reasons are unknown, but you quickly realize that there is enough depth to the story that keeps you engaged throughout its short 84-minute runtime. Slow West does something that I've personally never seen a Wild West story do, and that is essentially make it a road trip movie. It's in tone with what you'd expect a Western movie to be like, but it's a constant stream of new things happening with new characters being presented nearly every 10 minutes or so, whether for a quick scene or returning again for a stronger purpose later in the film. It's a unique take on the Western narrative that I found to be really fun to experience, even if its handling of that, paired with the underlying narrative at times, didn't fully work for me, but by the end of the movie, I was fully on board. Everything came together really well in the last 15 minutes or so, with one of the best ending sequences out of any of these movies. Slow West radiates this faint, distant memory of the American Wild West that none of us actually experienced, but all share as a collective conscious through pop culture. Locations are rarely, if ever, inside, choosing instead to showcase the Wild West as it may have been at the time. Spacious, seemingly infinite, and dangerous. Some of the shots in Slow West are breathtaking, such as this one right here, and it manages to balance its serious tone with occasional sprinkles of well-written humor throughout its short runtime. Fassbender's character sort of feels like a mythological figure guiding Jay throughout the movie, even when he's not playing a role at certain points in the movie. Like its title implies, Slow West takes its time, and with how short the overall movie is, it does somewhat fail at keeping a consistent level of engagement. But only a little. For the first 2 acts of this movie, I was sort of iffy on how I felt about it. I was enjoying it, yes, but its road trip styled antics paired with its mostly excellent finale really cemented a hearty recommendation for me. I think that if its ending was slightly more poignant, I would be giving this a stronger review, but as it stands, this is definitely the first great movie on the list.
Yes! Yes, Morty. Yes, we gotta get it, Morty. Come on, Morty, come on.
Oh,
no,
geez,
Jerry,
Rick.
shut up. Morty, yes.
Rick, I don't know.
8th Grade is a movie that has been on my radar since it came out. Directed by the comedian Bo Berman, this showcases a very real and at times traumatic look at the most awkward phase of your life, and looks at the most instrumental point of that instrumental point of your entire life, which is 8th grade. The movie follows 1 week in the life of Kayla, an unbelievably nervous and shy 8th grader on her last week of middle school. It showcases several slices of this girl's day-to-day life, such as school assembly, being invited to a pool party by the cool girl, and meeting high schoolers at a mall to hang out. These are all, mostly, trivial day-to-day things that a lot of young people go through, and seeing that youth experience, even with the added variable of social media, strangely remains roughly the same as I remember it being. Long, awkward hours alone by yourself in your room, looking up things online, and being interspersed with awkward attempts at conversations with the people around you that you want to look cool in front of. Finding yourself at that point in your life is incredibly difficult and is a process that you never really finish working towards, let alone by the end of 8th grade, which makes this point of your life nearly as equally painful and awkward as it was to watch a majority of this movie. It made me cringe, it made me laugh, and made me nostalgic for a lot of points during my youth. Bo Burnham did a pretty good job at directing here as well, with some pretty impressive yet simple, effective one-takes. The kid actors all do a pretty good job, and none of them felt out of place, which is an incredibly high bar to pass. Even the awkward boy Kayla meets at the pool party felt very natural and didn't distract in the least bit. I think the most impressive thing about it was that the movie managed to steer its own course rather than lean into the cliche that the movie seemed to be introducing with the awkward boy at the pool party. But while I did enjoy the movie, I couldn't find myself putting it any higher than this on the list because apart from one excruciatingly long sequence in the backseat of a car, the movie didn't really grip me in terms of what I felt like it wanted to accomplish. I felt secondhand embarrassment throughout a lot of its runtime, but something about 8th grade didn't fully gel with me. I think it partly feels like Kayla's arc through the movie all sort of comes together at the end with a conversation with her dad, rather than it feels like a whole arc throughout the entire course of the movie. All of the scenes by themselves in the movie work pretty great, but as a cohesive whole, it didn't fully work for me.
I don't, sir.
Hands. Are we the baddies?
Big oof on this one. This one is tough to talk about on multiple fronts. One of them is just the nature of the film, which is following a German family whose husband is quite literally one of the head honchos at Auschwitz. Zone of Interest never actively shows the evil of the Holocaust, but its presence is always felt. You hear the low rumblings of the furnace basically at all times, you hear distant and muffled screams and the occasional pop of gunshots, all while you just watch this family go about their day-to-day life, enjoying the splendors of a faithful and fruitful service to the Reich. There is an argument to be made that this movie glorifies, or at the very least humanizes, the Nazis in a way that might be uncomfortable. in a way in which you realized that to an extent, these people were just people looking out for each other, and giving themselves to their country in this manner was the only way that they could provide for themselves. But I don't really see it that way at all. This movie, to me, hammers home that even if these people were just looking out for each other, the casual presentation of this film reminds you that these people were indeed truly evil. Intentional or not, they just sat by and ignored the atrocities going on in their backyard, literally in this movie. The Zone of Interest really shows the banality of evil and the levels of complacency that people are capable of if it means to live comfortably. It doesn't do anything outright horrific on screen, but it's one of the most bone-chilling films that I've seen in a while. I felt every implied death that the film refuses to show you, every horrific and chilling instance that this family just went about their day with, and the terrible manner that their presumably Jewish servants were treated. This film is hard to talk about because of these factors. It's uncomfortable, it's eye-opening, and it's downright scary. The other thing, though, that makes this film hard to talk about is the most subjective thing about it, but it's worth mentioning, is that this movie, while only being an hour 45, it can be somewhat of a chore to sit through. It's very clinical in its editing and pacing, and I can see the argument being thrown around against this movie saying, nothing really happens. And to some extent, yeah, not much does. You watch this family make food, have arguments, deal with 2 children, and watch the father do his job at home and at a German headquarters. Probably the most, quote, artsy-fartsy film on the list. I mean, this film opens up with like 2 minutes of a black screen with like a low, creepy rumbling, and that happens essentially twice during the movie's runtime. I like stuff like that, but I could definitely see it being a real turnoff for a lot of people. This film, for me though, made me a fan of this director almost instantly, but despite all of the praise I would give this movie, I think it's one that would be pretty difficult to re-watch often, 1, due to its subject matter, and 2, its refusal to actively engage along with the audience. It's not the most outright gorgeous film on the list, that belongs to The Tragedy of Macbeth, but there was something so cold and distant about this movie's framing, and I really enjoyed its use of static cameras to accentuate the feelings this movie was conveying. Nearly every frame of this movie portrayed some form of brutalist architecture, whether literal architecture or the frame of the film itself. The editing was also very clinical, almost like the uncomfortable precision of a scalpel. This is how I would want a movie I made to look. Every frame was a painting.
Stop it, dude! I'm fucking bleeding! Yeah, that's what's up. Sorry.
I've known about this movie since the original trailers came out, and it's one that I've wanted to see for basically, 6 years at this point? But I never found the wherewithal or the will to just sit down and watch it for whatever reason, so I figured why not add this movie to the list, because, hey, if I'm going to be watching 24 movies, I might as well watch some that I've been wanting to watch for years. With all this time of built-up expectations, what did I think about it? Well, I guess in that regard, The Death of Dick Long is probably the most disappointing movie on the list, but given its placement, I think it's clear that I didn't dislike it. In fact, I actually did like it a lot. It follows 2 guys, Ezekiel and Earl, who are both just some average dudes from Alabama. At the beginning of the movie, they're with their friend Dick Long after a night of getting weird. They leave him in front of the emergency drop-off at a nearby hospital. They think that it was just a wild night and they'll hear from Dick the next morning, but he eventually dies that night. The rest of the movie is the fallout from this event and the pathetic scrambling that these 2 losers do in order to attempt to get away with their friend's death. They lie to the police, break some chairs, deal irreparable damage to their family and friends, and you think that the movie's underlying question is, will they get away with it, or how will they get caught? But at a certain point, you realize that the movie seems to be actively avoiding how Dick died. It couldn't have been simply getting too fucked up because there is a pool of blood in the back of Zeke's car. I won't spoil anything about how the movie ends up, but this movie somehow manages to pull off an unbelievably hard trick of having a grounded story with characters that feel real and fit perfectly in this movie, but also managing to have a plot twist that is really disturbing and batshit insane, but it still keeps that grounded, real, and not out of place feeling that the movie has already established. My biggest issues were that this movie had fantastic scenes of tension and pretty great character comedy, but there was a lot of this movie that blurred for me, if that makes sense. There would occasionally be like a highlight scene of tension or great character comedy, and then there would be this like lull of just kind of things happening in between another great scene. And not to say that those lull scenes were necessarily bad, but the movie fell in the middle a bit too much, despite the fantastic spikes on either end of what I mentioned. My other main issue was that I wasn't too happy how this movie decided to wrap itself up. Even if it worked thematically, it seemed a little bit too contrived, despite the technicality that they give in the film for its ending. I get what they were going for and why they decided to do it that way, but I've noticed that a lot of these movies on this list tend to keep going instead of ending on something really poignant, and I think that the death of Dick Long and Slow West are probably the most critical victims of this issue, but I would still recommend this movie if you want a zany murder mystery set in a world that you don't really see for this type of movie.
And you're 30 years old, you just stop your life and stay here. And every day she has to look at you with that sad-looking face. That's not nice for anybody, right?
The Farewell's premise is as sad as its title suggests. A Chinese-American family flies back home after finding out that everyone's favorite mom/grandma/nai has been diagnosed with a terminal cancer. But the family doesn't allow the hospital to tell her about this disease. They rendezvous back in China under the guise of a fake wedding so they can all see her one last time. The Farewell is another in this list of films that have been on my to-watch list for basically 5 or more years, and I'm very happy that I got around to watching it, despite its placement on this list. It still hit pretty hard for me at points because I have recently kind of experienced a lot of family passings. In that regard, this movie worked very effectively and hit pretty close to home and provided a lot of life-affirming feelings. I think the thing that stuck out most to me in The Farewell is the amount of restraint that the movie actually pulls. You would think by the premise alone that it would lean super hard into actively trying to make you sob uncontrollably whenever you saw an opportunity, but it was really more a bittersweet life-affirming film about family and finding yourself. There were moments, of course, that made me tear up, and there were some emotional gut punches for sure, one shot in particular near the end involving a POV of a car. But what the film decides to go for instead, at least in my opinion, is the feeling that you get while you're at a funeral. It's sad and obviously emotional, but there's this underlying feeling that everybody present at the funeral is proud to know who this person was, and you're happy that you were able to know them. The love and affection that everyone has for this old woman is bleeding through the screen, and you can't help but connect with this family and the main character, especially on my end, because watching this girl struggle financially, get support from her parents, love you mom and dad, really brought me into this movie. And throughout the whole movie, she sort of feels kind of like a third wheel, because initially her mom and dad don't want to bring her there because of a multitude of reasons, but she scrounges up the money anyway and flies herself separately back home to see her grandma. At a certain point, you sort of wonder if the grandma secretly knows and is just kind of enjoying the spectacle of her family being there for her at that time. There's a lot that is unanswered, and that's another thing about the restraint of The Farewell, is that there's all these plot points that kind of uplift a character's character, the financial struggles that the main character is going through, and a lot of the family conflicts surrounding the grandma that are brought up that build up all of these individual characters, but a lot of those plot lines are just kind of forgotten about because that's not really what matters. What matters is the family coming together despite all of these things. You feel the joy in the family bonding, making jokes and reminiscing, but you also feel the weight of the arguing, being mean and spiteful towards each other, and the decisions that they've made in life. All of this on top of them bearing the burden of this knowledge of their beloved family member on their shoulders and the camaraderie they all feel by doing so. I'm glad I got to know this family because they're not special, but they're incredible, as most families tend to be.
Can you just act a little less excited about this? Because this is my life and might be falling apart.
I don't know why women get plastic surgery.
Because of men like you.
Add this to the list of movies that I knew nothing about going in. The only thing I had heard about it up until watching it was that Mike Stoklasa from Red Letter Media called it...
It is white toast.
So it's probably understandable that I was a little bit hesitant to believe that it would be very good. But this might be one of the biggest surprises on the whole list for me. On the Rocks is the story of Laura, played by Rashida Jones, who, after a bizarre interaction with her husband after a work trip, starts to have doubts about the marriage and falls into a spiral of trying to figure out whether or not he's cheating on her. Her dad, played by Bill Murray, is an eccentric old rich guy who decides to intervene and try to help his daughter find out if her husband is being faithful. I think that if I sat down and explained what happens in this movie to you, you would probably ask yourself, 1, why is it this high on the list? And 2, how is it not dead fucking last? This might sound silly to say though, this movie isn't really about the story. For me, what made this movie so special are the characters, specifically Bill Murray. I cannot emphasize enough how much of the movie that Murray is carrying on his back. He supports the entire film single-handedly. Every time that he is on screen, the movie glows with a light unique all its own. Rashida Jones's character, on the other hand, is a blank slate. Not entirely, but really close. While that would be a detriment to a movie like this, one about two characters constantly interacting with each other, and having half of those people be dull, what ends up happening is that she's a great balancing act with Murray's character. He does most of the talking, leaving her sort of to react to what is being said to her. But the chemistry that they have as a father-daughter duo is just impeccable. And what makes it even more impressive is that Bill Murray's character is sort of like this gross old sleazeball. But that's like a slice of who this character is, and as the movie progresses you found out more about who he is, more about why he is the way he is, and it just humanizes this guy and makes him even more endearing. The movie oozes the feeling of a warm hug in the sunrise of an autumn morning in New York. The occasional beauty shots of the city sometimes feel generic, but sometimes they really showcase the beauty of the city, and it works as a wonderful backdrop for the film. There are things that I could go into detail about surrounding Rashida Jones and Bill Murray, like the mystery of whether or not she's being cheated on and why her dad is so determined to do progressively outrageous things in order to help his daughter uncover the truth. But it all comes together in a neat, clean little package that reminded me a lot of movies I used to watch when I was younger. Very dry, somewhat dull, but filled with characters that I would genuinely like to see more of. In a way, I was really sad when Bill Murray left the screen because I knew it would be the last time that I watched that character. And I wanted to be with these people more. And I think that's probably the greatest kind of praise I can give a movie like this. While not one of the best movies I watched, it was certainly the most surprising, and one that I think I'll only rewatch with joy.
I'll meet someone, and it won't be you. And I'll fall in love with her. And then I won't love you like this anymore.
A glimpse inside the mind of Charles Swan III is notable for a couple things. It's the first movie ever released by A24, and people seem to fucking hate this movie. I wasn't really sure about what to expect going into it, because this is one that, more than a lot of other movies that I didn't know much about, I knew nothing about this movie, apart from the fact that Charlie Sheen was in it. So, an early A24 movie, with movies like Hereditary, The Green Room, and The Witch, tended to be what they were noted for. I had just assumed that it would probably be some sort of weird horror movie, but I was prepared for anything. As it turns out, A Glimpse Inside the Mind of Charles Swan III is not only not a horror movie, it's a screwball, surrealist dramedy steeped in zaniness so deep that you could carve layers out of it like a cake. The movie stars Charlie Sheen as the titular Charles Swan, a professional artist who has a hankering for younger women. Legally younger women, but still it's, though and she's, The whole plot of the movie basically revolves around a night where his girlfriend at the time, Ivana, breaks up with him, and Charlie immediately comes off as like this weird sleazeball. And it's made right from the get-go of the film that like 70% of his mental capacity at all times is made up of sex, and his attraction to younger women doesn't paint him in remotely a good light. As the movie goes on, you sort of wait for his character to show more of that negative side of him, but I get the impression that Charles Swan is just a genuinely heartfelt guy that can't seem to mature past his early 20s. There's a scene later in the movie where Charles just spills his soul, and it's such a real moment that anyone who has been in love can relate with. I think the most impressive thing about this movie is the fact that it never feels like it goes too off the rails or never getting too weird. It's eccentric, it's a little fanciful, the characters talk super fast, they're spitting dialogue back at each other, and I don't know why people seem to hate it so much. I've talked to people personally who have seen this movie and they went out of their way to say this movie was terrible. I did not see it at all. I found this movie infinitely charming, really endearing, and when the credits rolled, I just had the biggest smile on my face. This feels like a passion project, a film made for love of the game, and to see people hating on this so harshly really makes me wonder that I must have missed something. If you're wondering why you're seeing a lot of repeating footage over and over again throughout this portion of the video, it's because you can't find this movie anywhere. The place that I watched it took it down within a week of me seeing it. For how weird this movie is for being an A24 movie, especially the very first one, there is a shocking amount of DNA that the studio is known for very actively present in this movie. A Glimpse Inside the Mind of Charles Swan III is off the wall, rather funny, but I can see how it's not for everyone. But for me, everything about it just worked. It's a character study, so that automatically allows the movie to lean away from needing to rely on a strong narrative, but is instead one that relies on the way it makes you feel about the character. And for me, Charles Swan felt whole. Despite his weird sleaziness, the movie managed to make him still feel redeemable. Charles Swan sort of feels like a real-life adaptation of a live-action Mr. Peanut Butter from BoJack Horseman going through an MDMA bender who just needs to pour his soul out to whoever is listening.
That's not how you think I'd react in real life.
If I was floating?
You remember that time you almost drowned? How fast I reacted.
She was 4. I remember you telling me about it.
Dream Scenario is one of the most recent films released on this list, and one that I had seen a trailer for. I had heard mixed to positive things about it, but I'll be upfront when I said that I really had no idea that I would like it as much as I did. Nicolas Cage stars in the movie as Paul Matthews, a sad, jealous, and honestly sort of pathetic man who suddenly starts appearing of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people's dreams. He becomes an overnight sensation after being written about in an online article, and very quickly has to deal with the burdens of fame in every conceivable and inconceivable way that might come with the fact that he's appearing in people's dreams. Nick Cage gives one of the best performances from him that I've ever seen. He perfectly plays this insecure, nervous, self-absorbed, but still incredibly lonely older man who just wants to be accepted. It's clear his kids don't like him, his students don't pay attention, But it's countered really well with him just being kind of like an asshole. He's actively antagonistic to old people in his life, trying to cling on to some amount of fame for a phrase that was casually thrown around that was published in an article that he didn't write. He comes across as incredibly petty, incredibly insecure, and like I said, really sad. The entire time you're watching this movie, you're just remarking at what a pathetic little man this guy is. But after becoming a worldwide phenomenon, you see this sad, pathetic guy suddenly have jaunt in his step, a genuine smile across his face, and suddenly ceasing to be insecure, but becoming way too absorbed in the fame that has been bestowed upon him and the distress that he endures when people suddenly start having nightmares of him instead of the passive dreams that people initially had of him where he sits there and does nothing. In that sense, it feels almost Lovecraftian, an unexplainable occurrence that dictates the fate of this person completely out of his control, and you just watch this guy try to deal with this fame and the eventual fallout of his desire to be loved and needed by people around him after living a life being ignored for so long. I could go on and on about Cage's performance, but really every single person here does an amazing job. His wife does the perfect, overly jealous type that questions him at basically any interaction with another human being. His two daughters do an excellent job of riding against the rise of their dad's fame. And Michael Cera, of all people, has a brief but important role in the film as someone trying to make a brand out of Matthews. The movie was consistently funny, the dream sequences were vivid and imaginative, occasionally bordering on the truly surreal or the genuinely frightening, and the concept seemed to be taken to the appropriate lengths that it needed to be. There were a few things that kept me from placing this higher than it is, one of which being the movie around the third act could have ended, but it seems to be a theme in a lot of A24 movies that they don't end when they probably should. Despite the third act of this movie bringing out a true sense of existential dread, I think that the movie probably could have ended a lot sooner than it did, but with Dream Scenario, the third act at least had a solid enough switch up that even if it was less interesting than the initial plot of the movie, I was still interested in the twist and wanted to see where it ended up. It could be higher, but being number 10 out of 24 is pretty good.
Running around, catching a boy that light. In moonlight, black boys look blue. You blue.
When I saw Moonlight on the list of possible options, I knew it would be one that I had to give a go. This was the 6th film I watched in my marathon, and of all the movies that A24 had distributed up until this point, this was the first one that they actively had a hand in producing. And if you ask me, Moonlight, in my opinion, from what I have seen, is the first real A24 movie. Moonlight is the story of Chiron, a black boy in the heart of what I can only assume to be like the ghetto of Florida. The movie takes place over 3 separate chapters of Chiron's life, prefaced by a name for each chapter. It's a very slow burn character study, beautifully shot, excellently paced, and wonderfully told. Even if at some points it is a tad on the nose of what it's doing, it never really takes away from the overall picture of a man trying to find himself and allowing that person to be vulnerable in a world that refuses to accept him for who he is. Except for a few key people in his life, Chiron lives a life of solitude, isolated from the world around him. The use of the titular moonlight is a storytelling metaphor as well as a visual one used throughout the movie. The use of blue in key aspects of scenes and specific framings never failed to wow me every single time that it was utilized, and it made me revel in the visual marvel that director Barry Jenkins managed to accomplish. I've heard complaints that Chiron's character is basically non-existent, a blank slate that you can glean nothing from, but I think that's sort of the point. At the start of the movie, Chiron says only a handful of words and only barely musters out much more at the end of the second act. As the movie progresses and you understand more of who he is, you realize that he isn't anyone, at least not yet. As he opens himself up to others in his life, he's often met with grief in one way or another, whether it's the death of someone important or an intimate betrayal, and it just makes you feel for this poor guy and you want to see him just happy. If I had any real complaints about this movie, I think that the movie hits some cliches that either could have been done better or not at all. Moonlight also is one of the biggest culprits of going on longer than I think it should have. A single shot of a door opening into a restaurant would have been a significantly much more poignant ending than what followed. I remember seeing this movie getting all sorts of praise thrown its way, and I always wanted to see it eventually, but thought that the hype around it would take away from the experience. But I think I can say that Moonlight is as good as people say it is. It's a pretty remarkable film, although definitely not for everyone. If you gel with this movie's pacing and the occasional artsy-fartsy dream sequence, and you're comfortable with themes of grief, Moonlight might be the perfect movie for you to watch, especially if you're in your late teens, early 20s. This might speak to you in a way that it didn't speak to me, despite all the praise that I'm giving it.
Well, I guess it's because I used to be a brother. And, I'm not a brother anymore.
The Iron Claw is one of those movies that I heard about last year that had an absolutely insane amount of hype built around it. It was primarily being showcased as Zac Efron's new stage of his career, playing an intensely personal and brutal depiction of Kevin Von Erich and his brothers who became legends in the wrestling scene as the greatest family to ever do the game. This is the only film on the list that is actually based on true events, and it doesn't hold back much when it comes to showcasing the real-life tragedy that befell upon this family over the course of roughly a decade from the 70s to the early 80s. The Iron Claw follows Zac Efron's character Kevin as its storytelling vehicle. You see the world through his eyes, but the movie is really about the family that these brothers have built for themselves and the events that bring them together and then eventually tear them apart. The saddest thing about it is that the family all believes that there is a curse upon their name, but it's made pretty clear early on that if there is anything resembling a curse, it's in the form of their father, a truly selfish and cruel individual that put glory and legacy above the importance of his own sons, going as far as to bring one of his boys that didn't even want to be a wrestler to begin with into the game, eventually hindering and corrupting his future forever. The 70s white-collar attitude affected everyone that it touched and prevented so much personal growth that watching these events play out and watching that unfold is like watching a train wreck. Basically, everything that fell on these brothers can be traced back to the attitude and parenting of their father and their emotionally distant mother. Zac Efron, as everybody has already gushed about, pulls off an incredible performance. Every single hit that he takes, he just takes it on the chin as best as he can, and you just see the pain on his face at every single event that this movie showcases. And the craziest thing is that apparently the director and writer of the film took out 2 entire brothers because they didn't think that people would believe how upsetting these events in this family's life were. The real-life story has even more tragedy than the movie felt the need to show you. On a filmmaking standpoint, visually, this movie is pretty stunning. While The Iron Claw doesn't do really anything groundbreaking with its camera work or its cinematography, there were a few frames of this movie that really made me sit back and think, damn. It captures the time period perfectly with its gritty film quality and the attitude of not only the father, but of his boys. I do have some complaints about the movie, one of which is not even really the movie's fault, but more the fault of the hype. I had heard that this movie was emotionally devastating, and I do have to say that while yes, I did find the movie really sad, especially after the really nice establishment of the brothers' love for each other, I have to say that the tragedies come so quickly one after another during the middle portion of the film all the way until the end, that it honestly felt rushed and sort of took away from a lot of the emotional impact that I think that these events could have had if they were able to linger on them a bit more than they did. I want to make it clear that I do understand that these events actually happened, and I'm not trying to take away the grief of those events, but as a film trying to emotionally damage me, I would have rather they let us sit with the impacts and the grief of each of these events a little bit more thoroughly. As it stands though, this movie is still a pretty heavy film to watch, and it reminds me of the love that I have for my family, and my brother specifically. The Iron Claw doesn't hold many punches, and the respect that these guys have for each other brought a smile on my face from the beginning, and then by the end, it made me tear up just by watching Kevin watch his sons play in a field.
Do you ever wish that she was dead?
What? Of course not. Well, it wouldn't be so crazy if you did. We can sort of want these things and also not want them at all.
Where do I even begin with this? Beau Was Afraid is the third movie by director and local goober Ari Aster, who directed one of my all-time favorite movies, Hereditary. Going into Beau Was Afraid, I was pretty hesitant because of the sheer density of this film, clocking at nearly 3 hours, and the fact that I felt that Midsommar, the director's previous film, was bloated, not that scary, way too predictable, and way too long for its own good. Despite that though, the obvious ambition from Beau Was Afraid that you can just glean from the trailers intrigued me, and upon hearing that it was basically a horror odyssey, gave me hope. I also just kind of love Joaquin Phoenix as an actor, and I was excited to see him paired with Ari Aster's flair that this movie would exude. Well, I am happy to say that while I didn't wholly give myself over to Beau Was Afraid, I was totally on board for most of its 3-hour runtime. There is just enough momentum that it didn't feel like the movie was dragging much until the last 20 minutes, which is when I finally started to feel the length of the film. The entire movie is about Joaquin's character Beau just trying to get to his mom's house and all of the literal trials and tribulations that it takes for him to reach that destination. He gets hit by a car, chased by psychopaths, has deep introspective dreams and psychedelic hallucinations that make him reconsider and contemplate the meaning of life and his existence in it. The movie is, as I mentioned, a horror odyssey, and what I mean by that is that the movie essentially is broken up into a couple separate arcs, such as him trying to leave his dingy and shitty apartment, finding himself being adopted by a loving and caring family, and others that I will not spoil for you. Now, the movie is technically a horror movie, but it's really unlike anything else in the genre. There were definitely moments that I felt in line with what you would consider a horror movie, but the entire thing is presented in this off-kilter view of what you know a horror movie to actually be. It focuses so much on Beau and his blatant anxiety and indecisiveness and inability to be his own person, and the world around him is catered to that anxious and terrified perspective. I really liked Beau as a character. I really felt for this guy in many circumstances, and that fear that you're not doing anything wrong internally, but like externally you're actually just a huge fucking asshole. That's like the center point of this entire movie, and like watching it play out in all of these like disgusting, disturbing, horrific manners, it's like the perfect modern horror movie in that regard. So many people nowadays aren't really afraid of like a werewolf or the boogeyman. They're afraid of the world around them. And seeing monster as metaphor personified as the universe that the movie takes place in was like a reverse Uno on a favorite horror trope of mine. And it worked so exceedingly well for me that it made me genuinely uncomfortable at many points during the movie. While not outright as scary as something like Hereditary, Beau Was Afraid left me tight in the chest for a majority of its runtime, and at one point made me jerk back so hard I nearly hit the wall behind me. It constantly breaks expectations in mostly good ways, a lot of outright insane moments, and a vision that I respected so deeply despite some of my issues with them. Ari Aster has rekindled my love for his types of films. A lot of people called something like Terrifier 2 a horror epic, but Beau Was Afraid is actually an epic in scope and actually earns its 3-hour runtime.
It's an eon if two strangers even walk by each other in the street, because it means there must have been something between them in their past lives.
Past Lives is a film from a first-time director, Celine Song. It tells the story of a woman named Nora who left Korea at a very early age, but not before bonding with a friend of hers named Hae Sung. The two of them finally meet face to face in New York, where Nora is living out a married life. Like The Iron Claw before this, I had heard that this movie was sad, and I was looking forward to bursting out in tears, and although that didn't happen, Past Life, more so than a lot of movies, even higher on the list than this one, has left me thinking. Throughout the film, the concept of in Yoon is mentioned time and time again, and it's this belief that if two people happen to come in contact in even the simplest manner, such as brushing together on the street, that means in a past life, these two people meant something to each other. This movie did hit home for me on a very few specific points, and as the movie went on, it managed to make me feel gross, hopeful, sad, genuine longing, and a respect for every person involved in this story. Past Lives is one of, if not the most human movie on this list. We all think about the what-ifs in our life, if the decisions we've made were the right ones, the wrong ones, and regardless of the answer, we may pine for that alternate reality that our minds can conjure. What makes Past Lives so resonant is that for Nora, that alternate life manifests itself out of the past and before her eyes, leaving her to deal with all of these emotions at the forefront. You watch Nora gush about Hae-sung to her husband, and there's this immediate connection between the two after like 24 years. In a very strange way, Past Lives reminds me of the movie Pig starring Nicolas Cage. Not necessarily in the themes or the mood of the movie, but in the sense that when I got done watching both films, I said to myself, man, that was pretty good. And then I went on about my day, but the more I reflected on each movie, the more that the lasting impact that they've had on me has become important. Love makes us do weird things sometimes, and we can all relate to what ifs or what could have beens. Past Lives brings that to the forefront and reminds us that sometimes the path we choose may be the right one, but it's not the one that we desire deep down. And that's the hardest pill to swallow.
You coming, Sunbird?
Sunbird!
Alright, come on then.
You know, when I watch the music video of 1979 by the Smashing Pumpkins, I get this intense nostalgic pang. Not from the song, but the feeling that the video gives. I was born in 91, but I've lived that life in that music video. I've been to those parties, I've been in those car rides, and I've been on those late nights with friends when the world was at your feet and the future was always at your grasp. But I didn't live in the late 70s. I was born in 1991. I grew up in the late 2000s. What that video manages to accomplish is showcase that childhood, growing up, and the teenage experience, at least in America, is to some extent universal. It's wholly relatable and forever entwined with our culture. Watching mid-90s not only reminded me of that, but reassured me of that feeling. Right from the get-go, I knew that this one was going to be pretty great. From the initial A24 logo being playfully made by a bunch of skateboards, this movie instantly took on an identity of its own. It was an unscathing look at the life of 13-year-old Stevie, a little kid with an abusive older brother and a mom who isn't around enough, who decides to start hanging with a bunch of local skaters and tries to ingratiate himself in their world. He gives up basically everything that his life was in order to become one of the cool kids. Whether it's picking up skating, starting to loiter and fuck around with authority figures, drink and do drugs, and even more. It's a hard movie to talk about, to be honest, because it manages to perfectly balance the tightrope of being painfully real, shockingly intimate and heavy at points, but still manages to be gut-bustingly hilarious. You really just need to see it and feel what it provides, because words won't do this film's vibes justice. While not sharing the same genre, I think that mid-90s shares that same tightrope act that a movie like Get Out does. Get Out was a pretty intense popcorn horror flick that dealt with some disturbing imagery and concepts, but still managed to make you burst out laughing. Mid-90s does something really special with its nostalgic look at a time that many of us experienced, or likely many more of you didn't. It doesn't shy away from certain topics, issues, words, or imagery, and confronts a lot of them up close with its chest out, asking you to engage with it on its own level. It's not as visually stunning of a movie like The Florida Project or have characters as great as Felix from On the Rocks, but what mid-90s does have is a lived experience. Even if you've never lived most of the life that mid-90s showcases, I think a lot of people watching this video will see themselves in Stevie and the friendships that he manages to create throughout the movie. Mid-90s tells us that family is important, but sometimes that family is the one that you create.
Yeah, my parents came home one night. Y'all were humping in their bedroom. You jumped out the window naked. They called the cops on you and everything.
Yep. Now I remember. Oh, shit, your mother hates me.
Oh, where do I even start with this? Red Rocket is a character-heavy drama about this guy named Mikey Saber, who used to be a huge name in the porn business in LA, but after a scuffle off-screen before the movie even starts, he finds himself penniless and back in Texas City, Texas, with his separated wife and mother-in-law as he tries to build his life back up from nothing. Going into this, I wasn't even aware that this movie was also directed by the guy that did the Florida Project. In hindsight, I can see the similarities between the two in some extent, and I do kinda wish I didn't pick two movies from the same director. In hindsight, I would have made sure not to pick two movies from the same director, but I've come this far, I can't turn back now. But as it stands, I can see the similarities between the two to some extent. The biggest one being is that this director really loves to emphasize the world that these characters are in with huge sweeping landscape shots that dwarf the characters that inhabit them, showing you that these people in a way are just like you and me in the sense that no matter what we do, we are nothing compared to the world around us. Just pieces in an invisible machine. Red Rocket is so fucking good, but it is a vile little film. Mikey Saber is one of the most interesting characters in this marathon because he starts the movie as someone that we've definitely all met before. Overly confident, yet most likely incompetent, whose inherent charm is usually enough to weasel their way into aspects of your life that you'd rather them not be in. But on a fucking dime, he begins to morph into this really uncomfortable, genuinely creepy and sickening person that you just want to get further and further away from as the movie goes on. The worst part about this is that for like the first act of the film, the movie goes out of its way to trick you into liking him. There's a scene very early on in the film where you see his weaseliness work into getting him back into the same house as his wife after their separation, despite them still technically being married. And throughout this scene, you're just watching this guy explaining what happened, talking himself up, and you know it's all bullshit. And you're sitting there thinking alongside the mother-in-law and the wife, oh my god, this guy is just the worst. But what follows for 30 uninterrupted minutes is this guy genuinely putting in the work to gain the trust of his wife and mother-in-law, as well as doing what he can to provide them rent and helping around the house. But then they all go to a local donut place, and Mikey sees this young cashier, and he starts eyeing her up real uncomfortable, and you think, no, what? This movie wouldn't do that, would it? And then, yeah, that's exactly where it goes. But it even takes it another turn from there later in the movie, and I won't spoil that, because it's this outright anxiety-inducing masterpiece of cringe and secondhand humiliation, almost bordering on the levels of Welcome to the Dollhouse or Happiness by Todd Solondz. This is a very similar sort of movie to 8th Grade, but in my opinion, does a significantly better job at not only an arc of a character throughout the course of a movie, but as a singular character study. It almost pains me to say how good this movie is because of its subject matter, but it's a fascinating character study of an incredibly selfish person and the cycles of grief and trauma that bring themselves upon others around them. Red Rocket is fucked up, but it's fucking good.
Did you use FileMaker Pro at the facility?
No, we use Google Sheets.
Can't compare that to FileMaker Pro.
It's basically the same, except FileMaker is harder to use.
Problemista is one of the movies that I saw nothing about, knew nothing about, and only had heard that it was good, realized that it was on HBO Max, and then immediately put it on the list. I enjoyed the look of the poster and its surrealist look, and the concept of an immigrant struggling to fulfill their dreams of being a toy maker but needing a dead-end job to keep their visa felt like a really natural ticking clock element, and I was very excited to see it. As you can tell, however, this is movie number 3, which means I must have really liked this one. Why is that? I think it's a multitude of factors. 1. This is Julio Torres' directorial feature. I feel like we're seeing the beginnings of a unique voice and vision in the filmmaking world. There is a true sense of focus and personality through every single frame of this movie, from its surrealist dreamscapes that are sprinkled throughout its runtime between separate dream sequences, flashbacks, and imagined worlds, all the way down to its very grounded real-world counterpart moments that keep up the whimsy with its almost storybook-like character archetypes. Problemista is a joy to look at, listen to, and engage with. 2. The struggle of trying to achieve your dreams and doing whatever you can to meet those dreams is a story that I'll always have a soft spot for. Like and subscribe, please, like and subscribe. And Julio's character, Alejandro, facing so much opposition and dealing with potentially the worst person in the world, played by Tilda Swinton. Number 3, Tilda Swinton is just amazing in this movie, okay? She is like I'm going off script. She is like the worst fucking person you can imagine. Always making problems for herself and screaming at every person in her life for the least important things imaginable, because if she doesn't have total control over something, then it's the biggest roadblock of her life at that single moment. It's cringe-inducing to look at because you know you've met someone in your life just like this, and seeing it play out on screen in this admittedly over-the-top fashion just makes your body physically react at points. Her being the only real outlet for a potential work visa is the cherry on top of this movie. There is so much heart in Problemista, and I know that is such a vague thing to say, but I can't emphasize enough how much this movie blindsided me. I laughed, I teared up at points, and I wanted Alejandro to succeed more than any other character on this list, and having him put up with Tilda Swinton's random bursts of rage made me really empathize with this guy, and seeing the way that they both grow from each other throughout this movie, even if it is mostly a one-sided affair, is truly heartfelt and moving, and it's an example of what movies and storytelling can accomplish. Problemista is a modern classic, and I cannot wait for another movie by Julio Torres.
A podcast takes a lot of work, okay? You have to organize the guests, you have to do a Google Calendar, and you build a following. It takes a long fucking time, and I've been working on it for a while.
Bodies, 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 which I will now affectionately call Bod X3, was a movie that I couldn't give any less of a shit about. Its cast was tainted by Pete Davidson, and its tagline being, "This is not a safe space," led me to believe that this was something along the lines of a horror movie directed by the same people that made like Mr. Burcham or some shit like that. But before I had put it on this list, I had heard good things about it from people that I respect, like Red Letter Media, and thankfully it had been long enough since hearing their praise that I couldn't remember the premise at all, apart from the fact that it was a murder mystery. Now imagine my surprise that I didn't end up just loving this movie, but during each one of these movies throughout this marathon, I've been taking copious amounts of notes. Whether or not I use them for the purposes of this video has always been up in the air, but during the viewing of Bod X3, I took so few notes because I was just hooked from basically the start of this movie until the final minutes. This is such a vibrant horror movie, despite the entire last 40, maybe even 50 minutes of the movie basically being lit up entirely by cell phone flashlights. It's a perfect example at how you can turn worn-out horror tropes into something new and fresh, and it's done entirely by the characters and their absolute, unironic, toxic friendships and their inevitable destruction and distrust of each other, but all through the lens of a bunch of early 20-somethings. Despite its promotional material coming across as potentially really mean-spirited or not in on the joke, not only are they in on the joke, they made the joke. This movie is not only a smooth and clean 90 minutes, but its characters are all genuinely fantastic, vile, cringe, terrible, disgusting, and brilliant little people. As the mystery unfolds, you start to doubt every single person in the movie. And while the body count rises, you start to hone in on who you're positive the real culprit is among these people, and you get so invested in every one of these pieces of shit's hatreds towards each other. The unraveling that they endure is done at a pitch-perfect pace, and the level of vitriol towards each other, while all still trying to keep their trust with each other alive by playing off their hatred towards each other as best that they can. When the movie actually finishes and you figure out who the real culprit is, it recontextualizes the entire movie, which is not only something I love about film in general, but when it's done at this level of efficiency, a rewatch won't even feel like work, or tedious, or why do I have to watch this again? In fact, I kind of want to rewatch Bod X3 right now. In the same way that I said that Beau Was Afraid is a perfect horror movie for modern audiences that love elevated horror and that sort of thing, Bod X3 is the perfect modern horror movie for the casual audience that can still reel in movie snobs. This movie is so good, I fucking loved it.
Hey, Mom. Did you feel emotional the first time that you drove in Sacramento?
I don't know if it's a shock or a surprise to see Lady Bird this high on a list like this. I didn't record myself through any of these movies that I watched. I kind of wish I did, for the simple fact that when this movie ended, when the credits hit, I just broke down in tears. It was like the last 5 minutes of this movie was kind of like a bunch of built up emotions. As soon as the screen cut to black, all of these emotions just flooded out of me, and it was one of the most cathartic cries that I have had in 5 years. Why did I love Lady Bird so much? What about it made it number one? Greta Gerwig is a name that I've heard for years, especially with the whole Barbenheimer thing, but Lady Bird is the first movie from her that I've ever seen. I didn't really know what to expect going into this, and I was honestly expecting a slow burn drama because, A24, but what I got is a slow burn black comedy. The tone of Lady Bird, if anything, reminds me of Little Miss Sunshine in its flat, realistic depiction of a disgruntled, struggling family that didn't shy away from some ugly parts about living that life or the things that can come along with it. I think the most important movies are ones that can bring a new perspective, or ones that can make you relate with characters and feel for them, or better yet, ones that give you a character and make you connect with them. I really enjoyed Felix in On the Rocks. I really empathized with Alejandro in Problemista. I loved every individual character in Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. I really related with Beau in Beau is Afraid. I could see myself in Stevie in mid-90s. I could see the person that I never wanted to become through the filmmaker of The Captive. I connected with Lady Bird. I've talked before about how video games are a transcendental form of art because they bypass this weird disconnect between you and the main character, because in a not too distant sense, you literally are that character while playing the game. You make the decisions, and whenever you talk about your experiences with video games to other people, you never say, oh, they did this, or they died on the boss over and over again. No, you say, I did this, or I died on the boss over and over again. Lady Bird is one of those rare movies for me that blurred that distance and tightened that disconnect between me and the movie. I didn't live Lady Bird's life. There are a lot of things in this movie that I can't relate to, but there was so much that I could on a deep, real level that made the connection between me and her tangible. I grew up less than an hour from Sacramento. I went to a Catholic school. I had somewhat strict parents. I was ungrateful for the things that they provided for me. I was an asshole to them and some of my friends, and occasionally just made new ones, leaving old ones behind and got left behind by others. I wanted better things, I wanted bigger things, and I didn't really appreciate the things I had, whether material, spiritual, friendships, or relationships. Cherish the successes in your life, but also cherish the failures, the mistakes, the things that prevent you from the normal things, and the things that keep them normal. Tell your friends and family that you love them because they may need to hear it, and you may need to hear it too one day. So that was 24 A24 movies. I have roughly 35 pages of notes in my document, let alone the fucking script. Watching all of these movies back to back felt like whiplash in a way. I would on average watch a single movie a day. I work a full-time job, but there were days that I watched 2 movies, one before work and one right after. It left me exhausted and worn out after every time I did that, and experiencing a comedy in the morning and a horror film at night, followed by a drama in the next morning, did feel like I was breaking my emotional receptors for a time. I was going through such an intense sway and array of emotions for days at a time, it really did feel like my brain was breaking around only the 12th movie. But I'm so happy that I did this. Even when a movie didn't quite hit right for me, like Slow West or even something like The Florida Project, I still found myself engaged with what the characters were dealing with or experiencing around them, and even in the case of something like Macbeth, I at least had the most beautiful movie I've seen in years. There's nothing I can say about A24 as a studio that hasn't already been said by more respected and more qualified people than me, but what I will say is that A24 reminds me of movies that I used to watch as a kid. It reminds me a lot of the 70s with a lot of big name directors that made personal, intimate movies. Watching characters that I've fallen in love with, or connecting with personal and intimate stories that allowed me to see the world in a new light, whether or not it was for a moment, 2 hours, or potentially sticking with me for the rest of my life. While A24 has established a name for themselves with their elevated horror movies like Hereditary, The Lighthouse, and stuff like that, it also has established its name through movies like Everything Everywhere All at Once. But these films are at opposite ends of a wide and very dense spectrum. What I appreciated during my time watching all 24 of these films is that each one of these movies felt like a story that needed to be told. Except The Captive. Because of that, I was able to take away something meaningful from pretty much everyone. Okay, maybe not Barely Lethal either. Problemista hit me hard with its experience of what it's like being an immigrant in the US and the things that one might have to deal with to just be able to follow your dreams. Dream Scenario reminded me of the fear of being forgotten, and the struggle that I've encountered with feeling left behind. On the Rocks reminded me of films that I loved as a kid. Past Lives told me that we all wonder what could have been. The Iron Claw reminded me that being a brother is truly a special and important thing. Mid-90s, 8th Grade, and Lady Bird all gave me feelings of both nostalgia, regret, and a sense that despite generational differences and how different we all think we are from each other, we're all cut from the same cloth and growing up is universal. I could go on about these movies for longer, but I think I've said my piece. Watch film, appreciate art, tell your family and friends that you love them, play a game, read a book, write a story, enjoy the sunshine, appreciate the moonlight, and do that thing you've always wanted to do. Love your face, love your show.
Tomato is a fruit, but it also a vegetable.